following is a work of fiction and should not be taken as actual history.
Meet Professor Roger Hill, historian, adventurer, and raconteur extraordinaire. He travels to parallel worlds where history went differently and brings back lectures on his findings. So grab a prime seat, pay attention, and take good notes. This is Alternate History 100. Welcome to the class.
Good morning. Accidents happen, and sometimes they have an enormous impact on history. Charles Goodyear accidentally discovered how to vulcanize rubber when he had a spill on the stove in his lab. Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin when he went on vacation and left his samples of staphylococci stacked in a corner, where one became contaminated with a fungus. Now put those two together. Where would your spring break be without rubbers and penicillin? And you gotta know that cheese was an accidental discovery. Somebody forgot some milk in a shed, and it solidified, and then they found it. Do-do-do-do-do. Gooey. I'm just saying. But I want to talk today about another accident. One that had a huge effect on the entire 20th century, even if you've never even thought of it before. So fasten your seatbelts. We're taking off for Cuba, 1895. Cuba and Puerto Rico were the last of Spain's possessions in the Western Hemisphere. There had been rebellions in Cuba since the 1860s, but in 1895 things really heated up when American duties on imported sugar plunged the island's economy into chaos. Some Americans thought that intervention in the Cuban revolt was necessary. They were appalled by the actions of Spanish General Valeriano Weyler, who had herded thousands of Cubans into concentration camps. And let's be honest, they saw the island as being useful to their expanding navy and feared that if they didn't go in, somebody else would. For a while, they worked to find a diplomatic solution to the crisis. And it seemed that one might be found. Spain recalled Weyler and shut down the concentration camps. But then came the spark that touched off the Spanish-American War. The USS Maine, one of the newest ships in the American Navy, blew up in Havana Harbor. The Maine had been sent to Cuba to protect American lives and property. And although we now think that her explosion was likely caused by a fire that ignited her ammunition stores, no one in 1898 knew that. The yellow press in America blamed it on the Spanish, and that led to a clamor for war. And not from the government. This actually came from the people. Hell yes, we will go. And though President McKinley had misgivings about the venture, he gave in to the pressure and asked Congress for a declaration of war. That war was over in just 109 days. It was like a young Mike Tyson beating up an old Larry Holmes. Ask your parents about that. The end result was that the United States took Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines from Spain and gave Cuba independence as an American protectorate. But what if the Maine hadn't blown up? With no casus belli for America, what would have happened? Well, I just got back from such a world, and man, is it ever different. Both here and there, while negotiations went on with America, Spain was also talking to Germany. Germany had a rapidly expanding navy and a strong desire for overseas naval bases, so they wouldn't have to rely on the kindness of strangers for refueling and repair. And Spain was coming to see that they were probably going to lose those colonies anyway. Over there, with no war, Spain had time to make a deal with the Germans. Kind of like selling an old car that you don't know how to fix to someone who does. A deal was reached in May 1898 that transferred Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the German Empire. The Americans were outraged at this clear violation of the Monroe Doctrine, but what could they do? In our world, they were quite willing to fight a war against the sick man of Europe. But over there, they were a lot more reluctant to take on a nation with the second biggest navy in the world and a sharper, better army. So President McKinley did nothing as Germany took possession of the new lands, despite cries from the yellow press, the business community, and his own party. He mitigated those cries a bit by annexing Hawaii in July. And though the Republicans lost seats in the midterm election that fall, they still retained their majority. Probably because the electorate was satisfied with the party's role in leading the economic recovery from the panic of 1893. For the next little while, things over there went along pretty much like they did here. All the major nations built navies, alliances were formed, a canal was dug in Panama, and then came World War I. Anybody know what Japan did in World War I? That's right, they were. And they were only too happy to take on the Germans in Asia and Pacific, while the boys in Field Gray had their hands full in Europe. So, Japan was able to grab the Caroline, Marshall, and Mariana Islands, including Guam, with no resistance. And while the Germans fought back in Tsingtao in the Philippines, they were defeated. All of their possessions were in Japanese hands before 1914 was over. There as here, America stayed out of the war as long as possible. And until they entered, German U-boats based in Puerto Rico and Cuba played havoc with freighters carrying food from South America to Britain. America's first action in the conflict was to capture those Caribbean bases. Taking a page from Japanese successes in the Pacific, America launched assaults on Cuba and Puerto Rico in August of 1917, seizing those islands and denying the enemy her West Atlantic ports. But not before German bombs had fallen on Miami. So yes, there America had air raids in World War I. The rest of the war went pretty much like it did here. Germany lost, and her overseas possessions were divided among the victors. The Japanese wanted permanent recognition of their gains. They didn't get that, but they did get something called a Class C mandate, which said that the captured lands would be best administered under Japanese law as an integral part of Japanese territory. So they didn't get what they wanted, but they did. Just like here, right? Except that over there, what they got included the Philippines. Now this is huge. It meant that the United States never formed a close relationship with the Filipino people. And it also meant that that fantastic harbor at Manila was in the hands of the land of the rising sun. And that came to be very important about 20 years later. In that world and ours, Japan spent the 1930s gobbling up parts of China. She had, as you know, tremendous human capital, but very little in the way of natural resources. Modernization meant that she needed iron and coal and rubber and oil. She took the first two things from the Chinese, who were busily tearing themselves apart with a civil war. And when Japanese atrocities in China led to an oil embargo, they had to look for ways to get that as well. Now, it just so happened that oil and rubber and tin could be found in the Asian lands possessed by Britain, France, and the Netherlands. And since those countries were all quite busy in Europe, it was easy for Japan to repeat what she had done in 1914. In both worlds, it's a long way from Jakarta and Singapore to Tokyo. That was not a problem in that world because those long supply lines were entirely inside waters under Japanese control. But in our world, those lines could be easily intercepted by U.S. naval forces operating out of the Philippines. This vulnerability was what led our Japan to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. They figured to smash the American Navy, grab the Philippines with minimal opposition, establish a defensive perimeter, and dictate a peace treaty from a position of strength. Their view, of course, represented a tremendous underestimation of American industrial might and a tremendous misunderstanding of American thinking. All they did, as Yamamoto himself said, was awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. But in that world, Japan already had the Philippines. It was not necessary to attack Pearl Harbor to keep the U.S. off their supply lines. And so they left America alone. With no Pearl Harbor, what do you think brought America into the Second World War?
German subs.
Yeah, American neutrality couldn't last forever. As in our world, German subs were firing on American ships performing convoy duty in the Western Atlantic long before war was declared. Roosevelt eventually used those incidents to fire up public anger to the point that let him declare war on Germany. The delay hurt the Allied cause, but once committed, American forces helped turn the tide and bring about the fall of Nazi Germany in May of 1945. Just like here. But what next? That world was weary of war and did not particularly want to fight a new one against Japan. In the summer, Britain elected a new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, who went on to give independence to India, Pakistan, and Ceylon. He certainly didn't want to fight another war to retake Malaya. The Dutch didn't like losing Indonesia, but saw no way to get it back. Only the French seemed eager to fight on in order to retake their lost territories in Southeast Asia, but realized they couldn't do it alone. President Vincent Auriol grumbled about it, and General Charles de Gaulle did much more, writing and speaking about the failure of the world to support French interests. One outraged American editorialist wrote,
"To say that the world has not supported French interests is an insult to the millions who died to save them from Germany. De Gaulle is the most bitter winner France has produced since Clemenceau, and we all know how much trouble he caused."
Indeed. Some think that de Gaulle's death in a December 1945 car accident was more than a little suspicious. Part of the reluctance to take on Japan came from intelligence reports that the Japanese had developed an atomic bomb. Yes, the Americans had built one on their own, but the war was over before they had a chance to use it. Could somebody else have one too? An answer to that question came when Japan tested one on a Pacific atoll in April 1946, leaving no doubt of the veracity of those rumors. A three-cornered Cold War developed, with the Soviets consolidating their position in Eastern Europe, the Japanese doing the same in East Asia, and the Western Allies trying to contain both of them. There was no war in Korea because that peninsula remained under Japanese control. But there was ongoing war in China, where the communists under Mao Zedong and the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek spent as much time fighting each other as they did fighting the Japanese. Both the Americans and the Russians supplied their friends with weapons, keeping that fight going on for years. There was also war in Southeast Asia, where Russian-supplied forces led by Ho Chi Minh made life hell for their Japanese occupiers. The Cold War with Japan meant there was no influx of cheap toys and electronics into the West. This meant that color televisions and transistor radios were not adopted as quickly as they were in our world. Most of their broadcasting was still in black and white until well into the 1970s. Such things as tape recorders, VCRs, and home computers also remained prohibitively expensive for most people for a very long time. Prices also remained high on cars and motorcycles. The absence of an American war in Vietnam meant that there were no anti-war protests. There were still protests over civil rights, but fewer than in our world, since there was no issue of a disproportionate number of blacks in combat service. And in an economy not stimulated by the draft and military spending, their unemployment was higher, and people had to look out more for themselves. So let's get to your assignment for this alternate world. Using the materials I've brought back, you could write about any number of things, such as compare and contrast their Cold War with ours. Pick any decade from the 1950s to the present and compare and contrast how it went in the two worlds. You can write about politics, economics, the military, or pop culture. Did the same leaders emerge as in our world? How did the stock market perform here and there? What happened to TV and music in a world where electronic devices were scarcer in number and inferior in quality? Whatever you choose, be sure to ponder how one accident aboard a ship in 1898 caused such a huge divergence. Ladies and gentlemen, you may unfasten your seatbelts. We've arrived at your assignment. 2,000 words, essay style, due next class. Class dismissed. Hi, I'm Gary Wheeler. Alternate History 100 is a labor of love with the twin goals of entertaining you and making you think. If you like what you heard today, please hit the subscribe button, give us a like, and tell your friends about us. Your word of mouth can really help this channel grow. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Until then, keep thinking and make some history of your own.
The preceding was a work of fiction and should not be taken as actual history.